Afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're joining us from the US. I'm Karen Doyle, Operations Director of CTAM Europe. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. We're really pleased to welcome for the first time Fred Godfrey, who is co-founder and CEO of Origin, based in New York City, alongside our very own CTAM Europe board member, Marco Frazier, who in his other life is CEO and founder of Screen Plus. I'll let Fred and Marco introduce themselves properly shortly. We're scheduled for 45 minutes, which includes time for a Q&A session at the end, so please post your questions via the Q&A button. As always, the recording of this presentation will be posted on the members-only section of ctameurope.com. If you're not a current member, please email info@ctameurope.com for more details. I'll follow up by email also about our annual executive management program, which took place last month at INSEAD, and we'll be opening up registration shortly for next year's program, which will be in June. So thank you for tuning in. I will take myself off screen and now I'll hand you over to Marco to kick off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. And hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm back from the extremely successful Stream TV Europe conference last week in Lisbon, which was attended by over 1,000 media executives. This is the first edition of that conference, and I'm sure it's going to be around for a while based on that success. So as Karen mentioned, I'm Marco Frazier, longtime CTAM Europe board member and founder and managing partner of Screen Plus Media Advisory based in Barcelona, Spain. And we are thrilled to have a very lively and occasionally controversial voice in CTV advertising with us today, Fred Godfrey, who, as Karen mentioned, is a co-founder and CEO of Origin, a creative technology company specialized in the CTV advertising space. Today, we'll be taking a dive into cross-platform measurement, factors that can influence an advertising campaign success, and many other topics, including whether it's possible to hold agencies a bit accountable to their advertising clients for performance and results. So normally, we wait for questions from the audience at the end, but today I thought I'd mix things up a little bit and throw a question out to all of you to think about. And you've got some time to come back in the written part of the Q&A if you're participating. So the question that I'd like to put to our audience today is, if you could change one thing about the way that owners and platforms think about CTV advertising measurement, what would it be? And think about that and we'll circle back. So without further ado, Fred, please tell us a little bit about yourself and what challenges Origin is designed to address.
Well, many. But before we dive into that, Marco, thank you and Karen for having me into CTAM Europe. As a native Londoner who has spent the best part of the last 15 years living on the other side of the pond, it's always good to reconnect with the homeland. And I'm very excited to be here today. As you mentioned, I'm one of the two that's responsible for bringing Origin into the world. Now coming up 7 years ago, we are a creative tailor, if you will, for brands and agencies who are looking to tell a slightly more personal story in the living room. And it all revolves around the fact that the living room is becoming a much harder place to justify one's spend. It's a very distracted environment. It's the most expensive screen in the home, but it also is the screen that has the most potential. And so what we look to do is marry the way that a media buyer might be targeting their audience with the creative narrative that they're wanting to tell. The basic rule that we have is one size doesn't fit all. And in the modern living room, if you want to get somebody's attention, you've got to make them feel like you're speaking to them directly. And so the way we address those challenges is over time, we have, as you mentioned, we're a creative technology company. We have built a suite of solutions that allow our clients to tell exactly the story that they want, or to layer the story that they want into a core creative they already have, that really helps not just get them heard by the audience and seen, but also to really help push on the objectives that they're looking, the KPIs that they're looking to accomplish with that media spend, which of course is why we're here today, because it's one thing saying, hey, I helped you hit your objectives. it's quite another thing to prove it. And that's what we do. We help our clients make sure that their money is well spent.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Fred. So, as I mentioned, you've been described as one of the most outspoken voices in CTV advertising. So let me start with a fairly direct question for you. What is the single thing about how the industry talks about CTV performance that frustrates you the most?
I think the one thing that frustrates me the most is that there isn't one thing. There are many things and many ways that performance is defined and described as a term. And if there's one thing that we are constantly guilty of as an industry, it's making sure that we don't unite around a common understanding. And as a result, you've got different factions and different sectors all taking their own perspective and definition of performance. And not only is it these people trying to create a definition that suits their own narrative, but they also then come into conflict with one another. When actually, I think that performance and connected TV is really quite straightforward, provided you understand that it's just a very different screen to all the other screens that we have been so used to advertising on. And the living room is a very different animal. And so that's probably what frustrates me, which is a kind of a non-answer, I hope, or think anyway.
Well, yeah, and as you said, the answer to that seems fairly straightforward. So why, in your opinion, has it taken us so long to get here?
Well, bizarrely, I don't know if it's actually really has. If you think about how rapidly things have changed, remembering I'm sort of speaking from the North American side of the market, and I should point out that never in the history of certainly of connected TV or even modern digital advertising have I seen the gap close so quickly between what's happening in the Americas and what's happening in Europe. Europe is, I hate saying catching up because it's almost like, you're sort of falling behind. That's not the case. Just television in the UK, for example, is just better. It was built better, which is why connected TV took longer to be necessary in the UK, especially, which is where I was from. But actually, I don't think it's taken all that long. It's happened at the same speed at which expectations have really changed. 5 years ago, when we were knee high to a grasshopper, and we would have a client come along and say, okay, so our clients are typically media agencies representing a brand, and we get brought in by that agency to help them with that brand. The KPIs would really be around things that were very much the top of the funnel and very standalone, like awareness, recall, a basic understanding that our brand is present and seen. And if you then fast forward like a year or two into the middle of, that time in our lives when we were all inside watching TV a lot, brands did start to sort of want a little bit more. They wanted to know that they were beating out the competition for consideration. And fast forward to today, they now actually want to see, more than $1 back for every dollar that they spend. So it's not really that it's taken very long to get here. What I think is taking too long is for us to keep up and to make sure that the clients are satisfied that we're taking their needs seriously and that we're holding ourselves accountable. We should be in front of their needs, not chasing and catching up.
That's a great answer, and I fully agree with your perspective on that. So in regards to the industry definition of performance for CTV, is CTV struggling to define that definition on its own terms or not?
I think so. And I think there are a number of reasons why, or there is a number of reasons. My grammar is awful. Sorry, I didn't do well in English at school. But yes, the answer is struggling. And I think it's because are you looking at it as a standalone, measurement sort of metric, or are you looking at it as part of a mixed media model? In which case, you've got to sort of clump together other, screens and other strategies that you're all, bringing in at the same time. In which case, it's just part of a bigger cake, and so that again muddies the water. And then the other thing is, we've spent 15 or 20 years really building an algorithmic level of success on on social marketing, or something that is touchable or clickable, and very, very trackable. And, and it's been very easy, but suddenly along comes the living room and it's like, well, I'm 8 feet away now from this screen and I've got a TV remote, but also psychologically, I'm in a very different headspace to, when I'm watching something on my phone. I don't, I'm leaning back, right? I'm leaning back and I'm here to be entertained and I'm not really here to be advertised to. And so as a result, trying to really define performance in this incredibly different environment is tricky. And one of the ways that I would have described it or did describe or define performance from Origin's perspective, 2 years ago is very different to how I would define it today. 2 years ago, I would have said our job, our role, our duty, and our definition of performance is that we're able to take the horse to water, but we are not necessarily the ones responsible for making it by the water. Whereas today, actually, I do think that the living room has enough power that it can and should at least be measured against its ability to make that horse by the water. I should have moved off a totally different analogy, but now
we'll stick with this one.
We'll stick with that one. Horses and water, right? But yeah, I think today the definition is if I'm spending $1 in the living room, how much am I getting back in terms of iROAS? And whether it's a 14-day look back window or a 28-day look back window, or am I just simply looking for increases in foot traffic? Something like that, something that physically puts someone a little bit closer to the product itself. The only thing, of course, we can't be responsible for is if someone likes that top or not. But I think we can now get people to the destination point at least.
Yeah, and you touched on the KPIs that brands are bringing in. Agencies have their own KPIs. So it seems that they're coming to CTV with those KPIs baked in. Is there a fundamental category error that they're making when they do that?
I think there is something that's being dragged. It's a really good question, actually. There's something that's being dragged into the discussion that we are very outspoken about, and that does concern me because I feel like it could be a sort of method of disguise, if you will. There's a big difference between delivery and success. And if I'm ever to promote anything Origin-y, it won't be our products, it would actually be our blog, which we write extremely passionately every week. And there was an article that we wrote about 3 or 4 years ago that was really trying to explain the difference, between delivery and success. And it's very easy to dress up delivery as success. Did I spend the entire budget on time? Did I hit the appropriate frequencies? Did I reach the households that the client wanted? Obviously things like viewability don't count because you've got the whole screen, but sort of the cost per the viewable completion, did the ads run through? Those to us are table stakes and they are delivery-based KPIs. In our eyes, they are not success-based KPIs. Success-based KPIs fall down to the objectives of the brand beyond the idea that they want the money spent and spent wisely. So it's, like we have a travel client, for example, who wanted, the objective was that we want to increase flight consideration to our part of Florida amongst the people who live within, a radius of an airport that flies directly from them to us. That is a success-based objective, a success-based KPI. Can we lift that? And of course, that's also a difficult one to prove, except we can prove through measurement that we did at least increase the consideration. We wouldn't be expected to track how many more people actually got on the plane. And that maybe we will in the future. But that would be an example, I think, of that kind of difference between delivery and success.
Sure. Yeah, success-based KPIs, it's easy to make a case for them. They make a lot of sense. So what does that mean for reach and frequency, which served television for decades? Are those metrics obsolete now?
They're not obsolete by any stretch. No, they are an underpinning part of a successful or crap strategy at the end of the day, right? Getting the frequency right is mission critical. And it's not just a case of don't over frequency to the point of negative brand sentiment. That's an obvious one. But also there are certain brands and certain sectors where, you might only want the message or the brand to be exposed once a week. And maybe there are certain brands where you actually want the message to be exposed 3 times a week because of the nature of the product or service that they sell. So, and those things are critical in terms of reach. That really falls under the bucket of, audience targeting, right? How granular do you want your targeting to be? And, are you understanding that if you make it this granular, you really are going to reduce? I mean, because connected TV, again, speaking in North America, we're in, I don't know, I'm going to make up a statistic, right? We're in 110% of households across the US. Connected TV is pretty much everywhere, but it's not all used by everybody. But we've got reach across most of the nation. Now, almost every living room has a streaming or digitally connected television. So the world is your oyster. So in terms of, yes, the reach as a KPI, yes, is critical because the brand wants to go after certain target markets. And frequency is also critical. But from our perspective at Origin, those are just part of the operational strategy of how a campaign is put together.
Got it. Okay. And I think that takes us sort of to cross-platform measurement. It's been sort of one of the unresolved big headaches in our industry. Where do you think the blockage is? Is it technical, commercial, or is it a question of agreement between the platforms?
I mean, you've got, I think I think this is where we hear most of the sort of idioms and most of the, terms and the phrases, right? Fragmentation, currency, brick walls or walled gardens, or whatever the hell it is, right? Like at the end of the day, an agency, somebody like us would love nothing more than to have this sort of clean room that sits, agnostic to the platform or the service or, or the playout or the device type. And for us to have this sort of clean answer to everything in terms of the information that we're receiving. But that's just also not embedded in reality, because each of these platforms need to safeguard their business and they need to have their own unique value props. And that means basically keeping a lot of, the measurement to themselves, which makes it therefore harder for other people like us to use in order to improve a client's campaign. So ultimately, and this is not a satisfactory answer, you kind of have to make do with what you've got and to work around that particular problem and just make sure that you're representing and quantifying and attributing your client's spend the best way that you can, even if it's by other means. But cross-platform management is just a tricky fish.
Okay. So as specifically as you're comfortable, what would you advise a brand that wants to run a campaign across linear, streaming, and digital simultaneously? What does a useful measurement framework look like today then in light of that?
I mean, I'm going to sort of spitball a bit here, honestly, because I don't like giving crap answers if, pretending like they sound informed. But I think what I would say on the fly here is ultimately, look at each of because you've got sort of different screen types, and then you've also got different platforms within those different screen types, right? Like it's one thing to run an ad on Netflix on TV versus to run it on like Hulu. You've got different audience types, you've got different content, and you've got different signals coming out that we can use to target against. So like it really does get very deep. I think if there was one piece of advice I would give, especially to the European market that, as I said, is catching up so fast with North America, it would be allow connected TV actually to stand up for itself, and don't think that it needs to be this sort of ethereal, nebulous sort of filler of, like awareness or something like that. I think my advice would basically be judge each platform on its own merit. And if you're looking at a highly complex mixed media model, the way you know that you are deliberately leading someone from one screen into another, for example, then you just need to, to track and to follow the success of that yourself, but I think it would be sort of not that difficult to do. But otherwise, I would say look at each of them, judge them by their own merit, even if that means more homework.
Yeah, I think that the homework aspect often gets overlooked or brushed aside because they want someone else to do it. And Fred, you're approaching all this sort of from a creative technology and a DCO perspective. So that's dynamic creative optimization. Maybe not all of our audience is familiar with that, although it is a term that's getting a lot of buzz lately. So in your experience, is DCO generally changing the conversation? Is it changing accountability? What is it doing for brands and for investors?
Well, I don't want to self-promote too much, but ultimately I would argue that, at Origin we have proven very much that um, any form of dynamic creative optimization, or what we call dynamic creative tailoring, is directly responsible for whether a campaign is successful or not. The three words that got me in the sin bin on stage at a summit a few years ago was, have we all forgotten that, quote, the creative matters, right? We are exceptionally good as an industry at building the plumbing, and the plumbing is critical to a successful campaign, but it's only part of the story. What someone sees matters, and I think that we have rather lost sight of that. And I hope therefore it's sort of, we're early enough that Europe remembers. I think also Europeans are, frankly, they're better creative storytellers, I think, often. I mean, look at the John Lewis ads, right? Marks and Spencer's, the tear jerkers, right? Like, we really do know how to tell a story. Like Hovis, come on, back in the 80s. I don't want to date myself too much, but it's the point is that, like, the if you can make the story better, if you can make the story feel like the brand is saying to somebody, hey, I recognize you, then you're going to solve one of the biggest problems of the living room, which is you're going to be getting the attention of that viewer, because nobody at the end of the day wants their show to be interrupted. Nobody likes ads. It doesn't matter what surveys you read that have been lobbied to shit. Like, it's bollocks. Nobody wants their show to be stopped to watch ads. So if you're going to stop their show and put a brand in front of somebody, you've got to offer them something of value in exchange for their attention. And that means you've got to tell a more personal story. And that is where we come in at Origin. We don't just operate in the world of creative tech, and we don't just have very dynamic solutions that let you tell each household a different story, but we also have an entire logic behind what should that story for that household be, based on the signals that we're receiving and the objectives, that are going into it. And what we have proven is that if you do tell the right kind of slightly more tailored, more personal story, just as if it's just a little creative layer that sits on top of the same single generic creative that the brand has going out to the whole, to the whole country, you can make a very significant impact on how successful that campaign was. When we measure a client's campaign for them, I'll stop here, but we typically take a percentage of their budget and we actually run their ad without Origin's creative tailoring. And then we run the rest of it with. And then we survey both cohorts, and we use the what we call the sort of ad alone version as the control, and then we measure everything against it. And that is how we can see that we make a considerable change to the impact, at a very direct level, down to putting more boots on the ground.
Yes, absolutely. No, it's I think that's the right approach. Storytelling is paramount. At the Stream TV Europe conference last week, I heard the old adage, content is king, over and over again. But there was also some other buzzwords kicking around, including native CTV formats. And it sounds like native CTV formats are finally gaining traction. What does a truly native CTV ad experience look like? I don't know that all of our audience knows that. And
Well,
why is this different?
Funnily enough, Origin was actually probably one of the first companies in North America to really bring native connected TV into the discussion. And there were other folks who were toying with it from a very different perspective of ours. But native CTV was actually really the premise of the first solution that we brought to market in 2020, which was effectively an extension to a brand's ad. So if a brand had a 15 or a 30-second ad, we wouldn't do our creative tailoring on top of the ad. We would actually build an experience that could run either before the ad or after the ad, or maybe a little bit at each end of the ad, and create a far more native experience, like a more content-based experience that could be maybe, contextually related to the show that they are watching, or to something happening in the world that day, that then leads them in through the right sort of mental and emotional process to then be more receptive to the ad. And so that is really sort of how we define native CTV. So we would build these, multiple different versions, again, like dynamically changing versions of these 15-second primers, if you will, or chases that would go after the ad that aren't an ad themselves. They're not selling a product. They're selling the creative. They're selling the ad that you're about to see. And we can bring because it's not an ad itself, it's bringing a more sort of native, more humble approach to talking to viewers in the living room.
Yeah, yeah. And you touched on the fact that the living room TV is the number one for potential. Is this exactly why? Because that same experience on your mobile would be emotionally received differently, or?
Absolutely. We have been focused on one screen and one screen only for 7 years, and it is the living room TV. And it is because it is a beast in and of its own right. And it is the most valuable. It is actually, I believe, the most effective if used and done right, and also is the one that can lead into a second screen experience at the same time. So like it's got a huge amount of potential around it. And I think that it's beginning to prove itself to that worth. The only other place we dabble a little bit, because it's very enjoyable, is the digital out-of-home world, which we've done a little bit. We do, we love running campaigns in airports, telling different stories at different gates, depending on the weather and what's going on in the world. But yes, like the living room TV is, I mean, it's the fastest growing. It is the one that is consuming traditional linear broadcast cable. Certainly in this country, it overtook it during the pandemic. And it is the one that is now seeing budgets being moved away from other marketing platforms or formats like social into connected TV, because not only are they finding the eyeballs there, but they're also now beginning to find the ROAS.
That's quite interesting to see the money's coming back and away from social now.
Yeah.
And I wasn't aware of the out of home that you're doing. Tell me, educate me a little bit more about the kind of stuff you can do in an airport, I guess, with multiple locations, multiple screens, and some. It almost sounds interactive if you're basing it off the weather or things that are happening there at the moment. Tell me a bit more.
Well, I mean, so we actually play so much with weather and weather forecasts in our creative decisioning. I talked about our sort of creative logic tree. And so, but whether it's actually in home or in an airport, things like the weather are incredibly highly relatable, quick, personal moments, right?
And that's
And
not just
so,
because you're British.
no. I tell you, it took about 2 weeks after first emigrating to California in 2012, when I literally turned around and I looked at the flip-flop sort of tan marks on my shoes, and I said, what have I been doing for the last 30 years? But anyway, I mean, I still love home. I'm a Londoner, born and bred, but I drift. That happens. Wait. Oh, yes, weather, out of home. To sort of answer the out of home, I'll actually start by talking briefly about in home. The first campaign we ever actually won an award for back in 22 was for Visit Florida, and it really set us off in the travel perspective. Travel is probably one of our biggest sectors, other than maybe retail and CPG. And the idea that we had was, in advance of the Visit Florida ad, we were going to tell people, depending on where they are, hey, good morning. If you look outside your window today, weather probably looks a bit like this. It's 30 degrees, it's snowing, or it's miserable. Meanwhile, here are today's highs across the state of Florida. Like, why aren't you here? And then lead them into a lovely, beautiful Visit Florida creative, right? You create this emotional resonance that immediately gets them actually thinking and having a little bit of FOMO and doing something that the ad itself, can't do, but is in support of that core creative. In out of home, it's a very similar thing. If you think about different airports, there are like, I don't know how many hundreds of international, national, regional airports around North America, and how almost every single gate has its own television screen. We partnered with Reach TV a few years ago to run a campaign for a CPG brand that was sold in the Hudson News. I'm sure anyone who's traveled through an American airport, will know Hudson News. Giving like a different reason based on today's weather why they should buy this particular vitamin product, right? And just create that slightly more relatable moment that basically, again, is to the thing I said a moment ago. It's the brand saying to the viewer, I don't just want your money, right? I mean, I do, but I've taken the time to tell you why I think I deserve to have your money. I'm aware that it's flu season, or I'm aware that it's cold today and that you're going, or it's warm today where you are and you're going to a colder destination. Maybe that's going to give you a sniffle, so you should take these multivitamins, for example. Like, again, you're just creating these tiny little micro moments that stop an ad feeling just like it's a self-serving thing, and more like I don't want to say like a public service announcement, but it's more informational, in a way that actually is providing value.
Yeah. I see where you're going. And Fred, we promised our audience we'd talk about brands becoming more proactive with their agencies in the outcomes. Is that what we're talking about now? Is that what we're touching on?
I think that's really, yeah. I think this is really where we're going, right? It's, as I mentioned, we are a creative and media buying agency, if you will, that is hired predominantly by media agencies, media planning teams, to really help elevate one of their clients' campaigns. And if I look at sort of how the landscape worked 5 or 6 years ago, it is not the same as it is today. Brands really it wasn't their job. At the end of the day, if they're paying an agency to know everything, then it's not the brand's job to know everything. But they were not really necessarily keeping up with what could be done with their CTV budgets at home. And I'm not saying that there was anything too untoward about that. But of course, as anybody knows, if you're an agency telling a brand, hey, by the way, you can now do this, this, and this, and this, well, then the brand's going to expect those things in return, and they're going to put a bigger red dot on your back in terms of what they expect to see back, right, from their media spend. And I think that as a result, it makes sense why you'd want to be, sort of protect yourself against that by just maybe not having the brand really know the full picture of what can be accomplished. But also, that's not how the industry is going to grow. It's not how we're going to get more budgets out of those brands. And also, it's not like brands don't, it's not like the marketing team at a brand, it's not like the CMO doesn't have the internet, right? Like, it doesn't take much for them to see how quickly things are evolving and how much more can now be done on a screen that started 55 years ago with a guy selling a bar of soap. There is more. And they do know it. They understand it from the plumbing perspective, the targeting and all of that. And they're now beginning to understand it from the poetic perspective, the creative perspective. And they're beginning to understand the impact that improving that poetry has. And they deserve, therefore, to hold their agencies, and their agencies deserve to hold us to higher standards.
Yeah. Well, you rightly said that there is more. So let me push you just a little bit more on agency accountability. Specifically, let me ask you, is it actually possible to hold an agency responsible for business outcomes and beyond campaign performance? Or do they always have an out?
I think that depends on the the deal, if you will, between the agency and the brand as to their agreed metrics for measurement, like their agreed measurement, tactics and strategies, and how much of the mixed media model is that agency responsible for. So I'm kind of not trying to give an out to that question, but the answer is, I mean, I think yes, I think brands are more accountable, and I think that agencies are more accountable, and they are understanding that, because the other thing that's really happening is part of the whole agency model is brands shop about, right? And they move between agencies, not just because one is cheaper than the other, but because one is promising the earth, or one is offering something unique and different. And maybe one of them is offering to be a little bit more transparent. And I think that the transparency is ultimately what leads to progress, even if it means actually exposing misfires along the way. What I tell everybody on their first day at Origin is, you don't learn when you get something right. You don't get better when you're right. You get better when you F up. And it's probably because you've been trying to do something better. And that's even happened to us. Like, we actually had a full year campaign running for a CPG brand that 2 months in, we had realized that we were shitting the bed in terms of what we were meant to be accomplishing for them in terms of their objectives. And we just there was this, oh God, they're going to stop the campaign. This is $1 million that we're, going to be taking off the top line. This is a real disaster. I said, why don't we just tell them? Just tell them that we tailored it wrong. Tell them that we got the wrong story. But we used that measurement to figure that out in time to say, hey guys, first off, like, we're doing a really bad job for you. Secondly, we think we've figured out why. And third, we've established to think what the better story would be. And so instead of just bailing on us, they were like, Jesus, thanks. Like, we don't normally hear this.
No, we don't.
Keep calm and carry on. And it turned out to be one of the most effective CPG campaigns that Origin had ever run. And they are now with us. That was the first year we ran, our first 7-figure campaign for them. And we are now, building the third. So it's okay to be wrong.
So that was a real adult moment of taking responsibility. So well done.
Yeah.
And I was actually going to ask you a question, not about you and Origin getting things wrong, but I was going to ask you a question about, without naming brands, if you've seen brands walk into a briefing with the wrong set of assumptions or KPIs, what does wrong typically look like from the brand perspective that you've seen in your experience?
There is someone on my team who might be watching this, who I'll probably be able to hear laughing in the room next door to me any moment. We had a story like this just last week, with a wonderful brand, but they didn't care what their money achieved for them on television. They just knew it had to be spent. And to be honest with you, it kind of broke my heart. Now, it's their prerogative, right? This was at the brand level themselves saying, like, we don't care, we're great. Like, we sell all these, we sell all the nuts we want. Like, I don't care if they, it baffled me, but that's sort of, like, brand level logic still exists. And I just think, well, like, if you could have a dollar make $1.10, are you saying that you'd prefer that it made 90 cents? Like, the last time I checked, we live in a capitalist society, and the idea is to make money, not lose it. And I think that, it just didn't make sense to me.
Got it. Oh, thank you for sharing that example. We've got about 5 minutes left, 6 minutes left. I've got a lot more questions that I wanted to ask you, and we do have some questions that are coming in from the audience. So I'd like to ask you, 2026 is a moment. We've had a lot of, as you mentioned, the amount of change in the last 4 or 5 years in the way things are measured, what's measured, our ability to measure. how would you define this moment, 2026, for the CTV advertising industry? And what do you think that lays the groundwork for the next set of improvements in the next couple of years?
So again, speaking from a North American perspective, but to a predominantly European audience that is so close on our heels. I don't think you know how close you are. Um, like, and again, if I can promote the Origin blog, we actually wrote a piece on this in December last year when I did a full analysis of all of our net new wins in 2025 and what that said to me about 2026. It was that up until 2025 or the end of 2025, again, North America, almost all of the growth of connected TV, from 800 million a year back when I first got involved in connected TV to the 40 billion that it drove last year. It was really, I sort of say, from the same 10 brands. Like it was major players with major budgets, dominating the screen. And it was the holding companies, the titans, that were the ones that were really running the show. But then when I did an analysis of the net new wins that we'd had last year versus previous years, with the previous years being the big folks, it was actually, there were a lot more slightly smaller, more independent brands, if you will, the brands that may not have belonged on traditional television or thought they belonged on traditional television, who are now starting to realize that connected television is a different beast, and that there are more tools at their disposal. There is more transparency, there is better measurement, there is better accountability. And so I think what we're going to see, and anyone who scrolls down the Origin blog will see, that our prediction is that independent agencies and their brands are going to start looking at connected TV as a central and core part of their annual spend and not as a complementary part. And I think we're going to see much more money coming in from smaller and emerging brands who are going to start to see the impact of a screen that they thought used to be too big for them.
That is a great message, that there's room for the independents and the smaller players, and that is made possible because of CTV, not traditional.
100%. 10 of the net new logos we worked with in 2025 were brands I put into that cohort.
I love that message. So we're going to move on to the questions, but really quickly, I have a follow-up to that. Who should the rest of the industry be watching and learning from right now? Is there any?
Origin. Us.
And of course, that's a given. Aside from Origin, who do you see as being a leader here?
God, I don't know.
That's fine. We can turn to the audience questions now because
it's a really good. That's a brilliant question. I'm going to spend the rest of the day thinking about that, but I'm not going to answer it because I do not know the answer. Origin.
Okay. We've got a couple of questions from the audience, Fred. So the first one is, I wonder if you guys think the biggest drivers in CTV advertising are pause functionality, real-time creative personalization, or retail media integration.
I'm definitely going to put on the Origin hat for this and say creative personalization. It's, we've got the receipts to prove it. It's if you're going to target 100 different types of households and demographics, then tell each of them their own story, because it will relate to them and you will get the outcomes you're looking for. But I will also say, and it's a world that we actually don't operate in, I'm actually kind of a fan of pause ads. I actually think they're quite cool. I think they're quite clever. And actually I was literally just last night, I was watching, oh God, I've been rewatching For All Mankind, and I paused, and there was, an ad. It was bizarre. It was a pause ad for Spectrum, and I'm like, why don't you guys know that I'm watching this through Spectrum? Like, we should talk about that, Spectrum. I know you're not on, you're not going to see this, but I do like pause ads. But for me, I think I would describe creative personalization or the creative as being like the last broken layer of connected TV.
Okay. The next question from our audience is, Where else do you find measurement data useful beyond proving to the client that you did a good job?
In flight, actually, back to the, like, honestly, in flight, to the story I was sharing a moment ago where we, were failing. We create our own internal feedback loop using whoever the measurement partner is that we have mutually agreed upon for a specific campaign. We will be getting that information back, understanding its statistical relevance based on the age of that campaign and the duration and so on, and giving it its merit based on that reliability. But to actually make in-flight changes based on positive and negative signals, I think is a really, really big deal. And I think clients really appreciate knowing that you're using this measurement information, in the moment, and not just after for a nice, sexy wrap report, tied up with a bow and a thank you, sir. Maybe have another.
Yeah, I think you're right. That is a very significant development in use. And we are more or less at time, but we did get a couple of answers on the question that I asked or referred to our audience at the beginning, which was if you could change one thing about the way owners and platforms think about connected TV advertising measurement, what would it be? And the two answers that we got is that they would like to see more around transparent accountability and more around clear, accepted, defined performance metrics, which sounds like people that are in the trenches and frustrated with some of the grit in the wheels there. Fred, is there anything you would like to add to that question about the one thing suggests the way that we change about the way we think about CTV advertising membership?
I
Measurement, sorry.
mean, measurement and membership feels like a membership, doesn't it? I mean, look, I look at this world from the agency side, not the platform side, but I can really empathize with the platform side. I mean, my background was as a publisher. I was at Scripps, and I was on the team that launched Newsy into the connected TV world when connected TV was still a baby. So I do understand it very well. And I actually, honestly, I don't think I could come up with a better response than the two that you already received. Just sadly, they also really do feel a bit like Hail Marys. It's going to be hard to accomplish those things, but transparency and accountability are the two things that everybody needs but nobody gets. But if we did, then it could be the glue that brings the whole thing together or blows the entire thing up.
Absolutely. A great answer to that. And thank you to our audience. And Fred, thank you. It's been a genuinely illuminating conversation. And as we advertised, I think relatively unfiltered. So
Yes.
on behalf of CTAM Europe, thank you to everyone for joining us. And back over to you, Karen.
Thank you. And Fred, it was unfiltered because I counted 4 F-bombs in there, which proves that you can take the man out of the UK or whatever the phrase is. But you know what I mean. It was
Yeah.
fabulous. I really enjoyed it. I like your presenting style. I like when you go off on a tangent because that's what I do. I think it's fabulous.
Well, thank you for having me. I love having a chance to talk about, the reason I wake up in the morning. And it's always fun to share these thoughts, especially with a market that is catching up quickly. If you can see the mistakes that we have made in North America before you have a chance to make them yourselves, then there's no reason why even the European markets and other markets can't sort of end up leapfrogging us and becoming better and more efficient. Like you can maybe avoid the icebergs. And it's nice to share because we all count on the success of our sort of conjoined Titanic reaching its destination.
Very true. Very true. And Marco, thank you for your fabulous interviewing skills and moderation skills, as always. If anybody has any more questions when you have had chance to digest it, you can either email me or email info@ctameurope.com and we will pass them over to Fred and Marco. So thank you both very much. Thank you everybody for joining us. And Fred, I'll see you in London very soon.
Yes, I must get over more often.
Absolutely, yes, you must. That's the last one. Yes, you must. Thanks very much, everybody. See you
Thank you
Thank
soon.
so
you.
much.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.